Okay. Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait one more minute before it and start on time at 9:30. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the reference seminar today. I'd like to acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wiradjuri people. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. So welcome everyone. I would like to hand over to Dr. Nicole Cooke, who is going to share a wonderful session with us today. Nicole, all yours.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Michelle and Ellen in the team for this wonderful invitation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Cooke, as Michelle mentioned, and I am a professor and the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at the University of South Carolina's School of Information Science. So just by way of brief introduction, like I said, I'm a professor. I teach in a graduate library and information science program, and my teaching and research revolve around equity, diversity, and inclusion and social justice. And I also do some work in information behavior, which tends to revolve around misinformation and disinformation. But tonight we're going to lean a little bit more on the equity side. And just for reference, you're looking at a picture of Augusta Baker, and she is the namesake of the chair that I'm honored to hold in South Carolina. She was a legendary African-American children's librarian at the New York Public Library for 37 years. And this was in the 40s and the 50s. During times that were very difficult for African Americans in the United States. So she was, again, a trailblazer. She had such a great influence on children's literature. She was a master storyteller and just was really influential in developing children's librarianship in the United States. And also of note, because it does very much influence the way that I work and conduct my research, I am in South Carolina in the United States, and South Carolina is what is typically referred to as a red state. And why that is significant is that we are currently in the situation where things are very politicized, particularly equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so it was just passed today that our neighboring state of Alabama, also a red state, has passed a bill that will outlaw all universities and just education institutions throughout the state from referencing equity, diversity, or inclusion. And so we in South Carolina are anticipating that we will be under the same sanctions very soon. So just to kind of give you a little bit of context and to let you know that we keep fighting, we keep doing the good work because it's important, and it's because our patrons and our communities and the people that we serve in libraries deserve our very best. So if we can't call it equity, we will call it something else, and we will continue to do this work. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing. Some may be familiar with my book, Information Services to Diverse Populations. and I'm working on a second edition. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And hopefully that second edition will be out at the end of the calendar year 2024. And so one of the things that I've been working on is this idea of radically re-envisioning library and information science, library and information services. And as part of that, it has several different dimensions. We don't have time to get into all of the different dimensions, but I am going to give you some definitions, again, to give you greater context. But what we're going to focus on this evening, or excuse me, this morning for you, this evening for me, is the competent humility model. And so that is a fusion of cultural competence and cultural humility. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the other dimensions of this radical re-envisioning. I was saying to Michelle and Ellen during our practice session that, you know, our work in libraries can become very transactional. And we need to, you know, be mindful of pulling back and thinking about the larger context, how we as individuals, how we as a profession come to our communities. And that means that we have to do some self-work. And I've had this conversation with many different groups, and inevitably someone will say to me, okay, well, that's all well and good, but, you know, how can I, you know, can you give me some practical or concrete tips for how to do these things in the library? And by things, it would be equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, etc. And so while there is action that needs to be done, and we'll get into that as well a little bit later, there is a very important and parallel track that we need to be thinking about. It's the work that we need to do internally, right? It's kind of like the land acknowledgement that we just had. We had a little conversation about that too. And how many times are acknowledgements given just because they have to be given, and they become tokenized, they become very routine, and there's no real emotion or commitment, or sometimes even respect tied to that. So it's the same thing. If we say that we're doing equity, diversity, and inclusion and don't really believe it, or don't really have that genuine spirit behind it, our communities know that, right? The people that we interact with, they know that, and it will eventually not be effective. All right. So I do think as much work as we do externally with our communities, we have to do as much work internally within ourselves, and also within our organizations and our profession as well. All right, so again, we're going to focus on cultural competence and cultural humility, but I want to go through some corresponding definitions with you as well. So in that previous graphic, one of the areas is dedicated to critical self-reflection. And critical self-reflection can be defined as the process of questioning one's own assumptions, presuppositions, and meaning perspectives. All right, so, you know, we talk about how society has certain norms, has certain things that it values, other things that it doesn't value, right? And we become socialized, and we kind of perpetuate these things even if we don't mean to. So when we step back and critically self-reflect, we think about, you know, why do I think this way? Why do I hold this particular belief? Why do I do things the way that I do, right? And can my beliefs be changed? Can they be enhanced? Can my perspectives be expanded, right? Because we don't know everything, right? But the way we are socialized and the way that we are raised, it leads us to think that, you know, the way we know things is the only way, right? And then when you travel and you start to experience other people's cultures and communities and religions and food and everything, you realize how we were socialized in our own communities is very narrow, is very small. All right. So that would be critical self-reflection. And so, again, speaking to Ellen, we're talking about collections, right? And when we are working in library organizations, what do our collections represent? Do they really represent the communities that we serve, or do they represent what we as library workers were told that collections should represent? All right. And collections in South Carolina are obviously going to look very different than collections in your library, right? Because you have very different communities than I do. And our collections, our services should reflect the communities that we serve. So some of this is going to all begin, or maybe starting again, in terms of thinking about, where you are in different processes with critical self-reflection. Another definition for you is radical empathy. All right, so in that previous graphic, I have radical empathy and the other radicals, and I will explain that. So we have two different definitions of radical empathy. Now, I've seen it attributed to two different people. I have the book references up here for you. You have to be a proper librarian and cite my sources. But certainly, there are lots of other definitions that subsequent to these two. So Valerie Kaur, who is an activist, says that radical empathy transcends traditional empathy. It involves actively advocating for the well-being of others, speaking up against injustice, and fostering an inclusive and equitable work environment. Radical empathy challenges the status quo and promotes systemic change. Similarly, we have Terry Givens, who's also written a book on radical empathy. And she says that radical empathy entails moving beyond an understanding of others' lives and pain to understand the origins of our own biases, including internalized oppression. And she talks about the 6 steps that she thinks are necessary for radical empathy. So similar to the critical self-reflection, these definitions of radical empathy are asking us to, look inside ourselves. What are our biases, and how do they impact how we think? Do they require change? Do they require unlearning something? Right? So everything is very relative to your own situation, but it does involve looking inward, right? With this idea of thinking that if I don't really know myself, then it's not going to be possible for me to really get to know others. And we have to get to know others and understand the meaning that they bring, the experiences that they bring, in order to effectively serve them in our organizations. The next section on that graphic is radical imagination. And radical imagination is the idea that imagination is as evocative as it is elusive. Not only does the imagination allow us to project ourselves beyond our own immediate space and time, it also allows us to envision the future. All right, the key word here is the future, as individuals and as collectives. The radical imagination then is that spark of difference, desire, and discontent that can be fanned into the flames of social change. All right, so when we think about radical imagination in regards to library and information services, what do we want to see in the future? Right. Again, we talked a little earlier about celebrating small wins and just celebrating where we are, what we have, and what we do well. It's very easy to kind of dwell in the negative and things that are not going well in society, and all of the strife that's going on in the world. But what does our profession look like in 10 years, in 15 years, in 30 years? All right. And so we have to imagine a better future. And it's not to say that libraries don't do amazing things now in 2024. What additional wonderful things and innovations will libraries be part of in 2044? Right? So we have to continually imagine and strive to do better. So that's where radical imagination comes in. Along with radical imagination, we have critical hope. Critical hope is a spark of passion, an abiding belief that transformation is not just possible, but vital. This is hope in action, right? And I want us to remember this particular sentence, hope in action. A vibrant and engaged practice and a commitment to honoring transformative potential across a vast spectrum of experience. All right, so very similar to radical imagination, but going a step further in saying that we're obligated, right, to think about transformation, think about how things can be better, and think about what the future looks like. But what I really appreciate about critical hope are the 7 principles that you see here on the screen from Dr. Carrie Grain. And I really appreciate the messiness that Dr. Grain says goes along with critical hope, that goes along with radical imagination, that goes along with critical self-reflection and the other things that we've mentioned thus far. So in particular, she says it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it's full of contradictions, right? But that doesn't mean that we stop, right? But just to acknowledge it and understand that, yeah, this is going to be a process, can really facilitate our ability to move forward in the process. All right. She does also mention that critical hope will have interruptions. It will also have invitations. You'll be thinking and bearing witness to social and historical trauma. It's something that you practice, right? And we'll talk about that when we get into cultural humility and cultural competence. These are not just one-off processes. These are continuous things, continuous processes that we will go through iteration after iteration after iteration. And finally, she mentions that anger and grief have a seat at the table. When we have to unlearn things that we've been socialized to believe, things that we, hold to be true, and when we have to alter those beliefs or we have to add to them, it can bring anger and it can bring grief because you are essentially giving way to something new and getting rid of perhaps a previous belief or previous stance, etc. So all of these things are very much part of this entire process. So again, just going back to the radical re-envisioning graphic, and we gave definitions for critical self-reflection, right? Looking inwards, right? Where are we? Radical empathy we talked about, and I won't get into them, but there are other radicals, if you will. There's radical hospitality, there's radical hope, there's radical candor, there's radical love, right? And I will certainly send these slides along with the citations, and I have an article that is entitled Leading with Love, and it goes through these other radicals. So you'll have more definitions and things to kind of think about when reading that. We talked about radical imagination and critical hope. And now we're going to get specifically into cultural competence and cultural humility. All right, 2 more definitions for you. So cultural competence is the ability of a person to effectively interact, work, and develop meaningful relationships with people of various cultural backgrounds. Cultural background can include the beliefs, customs, and behaviors of people from various groups. And I think notably for that, people from different groups, right? People who are from communities or groups that are different from our own. Complementary concept is cultural humility. Cultural humility incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, to redressing the power imbalances and to developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and defined populations. All right, so in a nutshell, cultural humility is very much about critical self-reflection, and it's very much about this idea that we acknowledge that we don't know everything and that there's always room for us to learn and grow and change. And then explicitly, as mentioned in this definition, redressing power imbalances, right? So we are in a society where different groups have privileges that others don't, right? There are groups that have disadvantages that other people do not have. And, we all have different privileges and different disadvantages that we deal with. And they create power imbalances. And it means that someone is going to experience your community in a different way than you do. Someone in your organization could be treated very differently than you are, right? And so you don't know that because you're not necessarily involved in it, but we have to acknowledge that everyone in every group are not treated the same and that there are power imbalances, and that really impacts how people move through the world. And it's definitely going to impact how people come into our libraries when we are working with them. So one thing about cultural competence and cultural humility, these are both concepts that emerged in the applied health sciences. And this is in the late 70s and the 80s. And then in the 80s, we saw lots of models coming through. So our applied health sciences are our drug counselors, our medical first responders, our doctors, our nurses, our social workers, right? So these are public facing, service oriented professions that routinely deal with cultures and groups that are different from the providers. And so this is kind of a academic way of saying essentially that you have a lot of predominantly white professions that are serving a lot of BIPOC communities. So by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, other people of color, right? And so the applied health sciences were having these conversations because they knew that it was going to be difficult to go into communities and be empathetic, right? And be willing and able and ready to respect people who have very different cultures, very different practices, and have very different needs. All right. So the model that I started working with when I started this work comes from Cross, Bazran, Dennis, and Isaac, and this is a model from 1989. And I'm going to go through these different categories. And so I want to mention that the models of cultural competence in applied health sciences tend to be linear, right? So from one side to another. So cultural destructiveness is this idea that people can actually hate and be destructive towards groups that are not like them. And by destructive, I don't just mean they don't like them. This is when you get into violence. This is when you get into lynching. You get into cross burning. There have been lots of talks in the US about Black Wall Street that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was a very thriving Black community that was literally burned to the ground by white supremacists. So this is the type of destruction that is represented in this category. The next one is cultural incapacity. And this is, perhaps the group hates people that are other, that are different, that are not part of, their own group, but they're not physically violent, right? So they're not burning down towns, they're not killing people, etc. Next, there is cultural blindness. And cultural blindness is really the equivalent of when you hear someone say, oh, I don't see color. I treat everyone the same. right? And we've also heard a lot of talk about color blindness, right? And so that's really where cultural blindness kind of sits. And it's this idea that I'm just going to ignore that there are any differences, and just, they're gonna stay in that space, and that way they don't have to turn left, they don't have to turn right, they don't have to do anything in the face of any type of difference. And it's really a dangerous place to be, and it's a place that really shuts down any type of conversation, change, and there's certainly no self-reflection in that box. Next, we have cultural sensitivity, or in other models, it's called pre-competence. And that's where people decide, or not decide, that might not be the right word, but they get to the point where they are gaining some of that cultural humility, right? They know that they need to do better, they need to learn more, etc., but they're not quite sure what to do, right? So that's the beginning of a good path, if you will. Next, we have cultural competence. And again, you've got that cultural humility. You want to do something, right? And you're starting to learn more. You're starting to do more, right? So if you learn about your community, maybe you're doing an audit or some type of community scan, and you recognize that there's a particular group in the community that is not being adequately served in your library, and that means that you have implemented change to your services, or maybe even to your collection. And so the library is more representative of this community, right? So that's where you're going to find cultural competence. The last category here is cultural proficiency. And I will say I've never liked the word proficiency, because to me it signals that once you are culturally proficient, that it's a one and done. You don't have to do anything else. And like I said earlier, and we'll repeat in the next few slides, this is an ongoing process, right? So when you're culturally proficient, you are doing the work. You are engaged with your communities, right? Assuming and that most organizations are going to have multiple communities that they're serving, right? Your services are reflective of your communities. Your collections are reflective of your communities. You are engaging with the communities to kind of co-produce the experiences that they have inside of your buildings. Okay, so that's cultural proficiency. Now, when I was working with cultural competence in 2016, when I published information services to diverse populations, this was my take on the previous model that I just showed you by Cross and his colleagues. And I made two major changes. I made my version of this cultural competence continuum into a circle, right? I wanted to find a way to imply that it was a cycle, right? This wasn't just, oh, I heard Dr. Cooke speak in 2024. I'm good. I'm culturally competent and don't have to do anything else, right? And maybe I'll see her in 2025 and then I'll kind of re-up my cultural competence, right? And that's just not how this works. So I also wanted to use a cycle to imply that there actually can be a little backsliding in this process, right? So for example, if you were to move to a different community, you're not necessarily competent in that new community. You could actually slide back to pre-competence, right? Until you get up to speed and you get to know your new community. All right. And the other major change that I made to this particular model in 2016 is you can see the box on the left-hand side. And I really wanted to overlay cultural humility onto cultural competence, right? Because they are two theories that really work in tandem with one another and they dovetail together. Now, after the publication in 2016, there were some authors that I became aware of that were really dismissive of cultural competence. They said cultural competence was passé and it was really all about cultural humility. And I don't feel that way. I very much think that they they need to work together, and they are best, or shall I say, most effective to us as library and information science professionals when we tackle them together. So I want to go through the revised model that I'll be hopefully publishing at the end of 2024 in the second edition of Information Services to Diverse Populations. And so just to give you a little background on this, last year, or actually end of 2022 into 2023, I asked about 75 people to look at this previous model, this model here, and I asked them, what worked for you in this model? What doesn't work for you? And I got different answers. They were very insightful. I was very grateful for people's opinions. We changed the names of the categories, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides. We made it a full circle, right? Instead of the circle that kind of had the break in it. We still have very influential cultural humility overlaid on top of cultural competence. And I do want to point out the middle where you see kind of the squiggly lines. And I wanted to include that because, you know, when we're doing this critical self-reflection and we're doing this internal work in preparation to do the external work, it can be overwhelming, right? And it also varies from person to person. So let's say my journey to cultural, what I'm now calling cultural dexterity and safety, may not be the same as Ellen's, may not be the same as Michelle's, right? So that nebulous middle ground is really to accommodate for the individuality and the nuance that happens when people go through the cultural competence and cultural humility journey. All right, so let's talk about the new categories a little bit. So instead of cultural destructiveness that I defined for you a little bit earlier, we did change that category title to cultural repudiation and harm. All right, so again, the definition remains the same. So we're talking about the hatred of other groups and cultures that results in the active harm and erasure of said groups. All right, so the same types of examples, lynching and physical aggressions that can perpetuate both mental and physical harm. And that includes the now in 2024, the creation and spread of misinformation and disinformation. The next one we have is cultural indifference. It was previously cultural incapacity. And cultural indifference is cultural injustice without the component of intentional action. Those who are indifferent are still averse to people who are different from them, but they are not making active strides to harm or erase them. Those who are different may still tokenize or fetishize those who are different from them. They lack cultural literacy, and they are culturally insensitive and callow. They rely on false and offensive stereotypes, and as a result, that can also spread misinformation and disinformation about others. So when you encounter folks who are culturally indifferent, you might hear things about other groups like they're taking our jobs, you know, they're coming in here illegally. I wish those people would go back to their own countries. That person is beneath me, right? With the implication that they are beneath them because they're not like them. All right, so that would be cultural indifference. Next, we have cultural avoidance, which was previously cultural blindness. This was one of the most common comments when I was doing this particular research, that people didn't like the word blindness. They felt or they feel that it is ableist. So we wanted to take that obviously out of the equation. We don't want the model to be offensive if we can help it, right? So now we're talking about avoidance. Again, avoiders inherently know that there are differences amongst cultural groups, but actively choose to dismiss or ignore these differences. They neither defend nor advocate for other cultural groups, nor do they seek to erase them. Their silence and apathy make them complicit in the perpetuation of structural barriers and discrimination. So if you encounter folks who are culturally avoidant, you may hear things like, I don't see color, right? And we talked about this in color blindness earlier. You may also hear people say, talking about race makes you a racist. You may hear someone say, I treat everyone the same. You may hear someone say, I have Black friends, or insert whatever group they're trying to defend themselves against. And you will also often hear, I don't want to offend anyone. And you'll also hear, everyone is so sensitive these days. All right, we have cultural awareness. And that title is wrong. That should be cultural awareness. It was previously pre-competence. So those who are in the pre-competence stage are becoming culturally and intellectually humble and are recognizing people and cultures different from themselves. But instead of resenting or hating others, they embrace them. They celebrate the differences and understand their inherent value. The pre-competent are unlearning false assumptions and socialization, and they are gaining cultural awareness and sensitivity. They now realize how harmful fetishes, tokenization, stereotypes, and microaggressions are. They are at the junction between new knowledge and action. All right, so although the hope is that the culturally ignorant, which would be the avoiders or the indifferent, will eventually experience an awakening that will bring them to cultural pre-competence and beyond, many people begin their journeys here. All right, so and that's part of this nebulous area. Like, everyone may not be going through all 7 of these categories in the cycle, right? What we tend to encounter are people who started pre-competence, which is not a bad thing, right? Because we want those who are actively harming and erasing others. We want them to be the minority, right? So to say that a lot of people start at the cultural awareness stage and work their way up to cultural activism, all right? And everyone goes through that in different ways, all right? And so again, kind of that nebulous middle area. When folks are in this stage, they may wonder, how can I help? How can I do more? What do I need to do to, be more effective, right? So lots of question asking and wanting to do more. All right. And this should be cultural competence instead of just competence, but this one didn't change that much. The culturally competent are putting their new knowledge and sensibilities to use. Not only do they recognize and celebrate differences, but they also prioritize them, and they actively seek out additional voices and perspectives from different cultures. They defend and advocate for other cultural groups without their access or privilege. They are no longer silent, and they seek solutions for structural barriers and discrimination. All right, so that's a lot, right? And this is starting to move into action, right? Which is where we want to be. We want to actually be doing something with the new knowledge and awareness that we have. All right, so again, competence is not a static existence, right? So it's not that linear model, but it's a cycle. It must be maintained, right? And that means that we have to work to maintain it. All right, so then we move to cultural dexterity and safety, and that used to be cultural proficiency. So dexterity implies that the culturally competent are maintaining their competence with continuous knowledge and active work. They may also be competent in multiple areas and in multiple cultures. Their activity is not only at the micro or meso level, but it also extends to the macro level. And so let me back up and just say that the micro level would be the work that you do with yourself, right? So the critical self-reflection, that would be considered micro level work, right? Because it's just for you. Meso, which means middle, right? That's work that you do in your departments or in your organizations, etc. And then macro would be the larger community, right? So say on a national or international level. All right, so again, when you are in the space of cultural dexterity and safety, this is not only work at the micro or meso levels, but it also extends to the macro level as well. All right. Now, the last one, this cultural activism, this is actually a new category based on the feedback. So this is, again, an extended model of what was previously published in 2016. So cultural activism, the culturally competent and dexterous are engaging in actions that work towards equity for everyone at all levels. They are engaged in work that is socially just, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and decolonizing, and that's just to name a few. And so while wholly complementary to one another, each of these that I mentioned, anti-racism, social justice, anti-oppression, decolonization, they all have their own bodies of literature, models, and goals, right? But they are working in tandem here to represent the different kinds of action and activism we can be engaged in. The common denominator here is taking action that aims to achieve equity for all and eliminate structural barriers and discrimination. All right. Let's see. All right, so that's what I'm calling the competent humility model. And again, that'll be out in print, hopefully by the end of this calendar year. And so as I move towards closing, I just want to kind of pull some of the threads together. As I know I've thrown a lot of information and definitions at you. And so we went through cultural competence and cultural humility by way of the new competent humility model. And that is, it's a process, right? It's an ongoing cyclical process that we go through. And essentially it brings us from avoiding and disparaging other groups and other cultures and getting to a place where we can prioritize and celebrate groups and communities that are different from us, right? And when we get into this space that we can celebrate and prioritize, we are exhibiting cultural humility, right? And cultural humility is this constant ethos that we need to have that reminds us that we all have a way to go, right? There's always something for us to learn and do better, okay? So we focused on the competent humility model, but we did also talk about radical empathy. We talked about radical imagination and critical hope, right? So when we start bringing all of these things together, once you reach, let's see, cultural competence and you reach cultural dexterity and cultural activism, how do we use that new level of awareness to radically imagine a better future, right? And by a better future for our communities and also for our profession and for our libraries, right? We also talked about critical self-reflection. And for me, I think critical self-reflection is kind of where everything starts. And it's kind of one of the common denominators between the other three categories, because there has to be some level of you asking yourself questions that will spur you to become more aware or spur you to imagine different things in a different way of being, right? And will inspire you to be empathetic to folks that are different from you. All right, so that's what I'm kind of conceptualizing as radical re-envisioning. And again, I'll return to an anecdote that I was having this conversation with a group of students in another graduate LIS program, and we talked about a lot of these things, in particular cultural competence and cultural humility. And the question was asked, well, can you just give us some concrete tips on how to do equity and do diversity in libraries, right? And I have to say I was a little disappointed in that question, but I understand it. But what I said was, you don't just do diversity or social justice, right? So that's not quite the right way to think about it. But also, I really think that this radical re-envisioning has to be part and parcel of the action that we do, right? So you can't just have concrete tips and tricks on how to do things, right? There is a certain dimension of our job that is transactional, and there are lots of skills that we need to know. So let me just say that. But I do think that these actions and these skills have to have a foundation of cultural competence, cultural humility, empathy, imagination, and reflection, right? So we have to work in tandem. Like if you want to think of them as parallel tracks, all good, right? But we have to have this skill set. And some people might call them soft skills or things, think that they're imply that they're not important. But I think they really are, especially if we're working in 2024, we are probably always going to be working in some way, shape, or form with communities that are different from us. So I think we very much need to have this undergirding, this foundation before any real, meaningful, or sustainable action can occur. So with that said, I hope we have a few minutes for question and answer, but I am at the end of my presentation. I want to acknowledge the wonderful graphic artists who have really helped me conceptualize some of the things that I shared with you, David Michael Moore and Alejandra Diaz. Up top, I have my social media handle and the website where we do a lot of our lectures and webinars, things that are all freely available. Would love for folks to register and come visit. But thank you so much for your time and engaging with this conversation. I know it's a lot, but I do hope, I should say, that it will be helpful to you. And thanks again to Michelle and Ellen and the team for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Nicole Cooke, for your wonderful presentation. That was quite, I'd say, made me think a lot, which I really appreciate. I'm opening up for questions now. If you have any questions, can you please place them in the chat? But I want to just ask you a question, Nicole. My question is, what projects or initiatives have you seen that have really, overlaid the cultural humility model with library services? Have you got any examples that you've seen it work really well in America? Because I'm obviously aware, even here in Australia, there is a lot of questioning about what we've got in our collections and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I just heard an example in this past week that was not surprising, but it really gave me perspective on how small changes matter, right? So, for example, someone mentioned that a library that they visited had readers, the little glasses, the readers for checkout in the library. So someone, and you know what, let me give credit where credit is due. I just remembered that it was Emily Drabinski, our current president of the American Library Association, visited this library and noticed that they had readers for checkout. So that means that someone noticed that a lot of the folks coming in had vision issues, not necessarily serious, but wanted to facilitate their enjoyment and the way that they could use the resources in the library, right? So if you forgot your glasses, no problem, you can check a pair out, right? And then you could always think of some of these innovations like on a spectrum, right? They don't always have to be these grand, we're gonna change the way the whole state works, right? It doesn't always have to be these very large, grand gestures. It can be little things that make a huge difference. Um, I remember a library in my home state of New Jersey, here in the States. Um, there was a director who wasn't particularly culturally competent, said, I don't have to worry about any disabled patrons coming into the library. So I don't even worry about that. And so what it came down to is that his building did not have an accessible entrance and did not have an elevator, right? So no, you don't have anyone in a wheelchair coming into your building because they literally cannot,
Mm.
right? So that is a example on the other side of a complete lack of cultural competence and humility. And so he's not asking any questions. Like, so he's probably in that um, indifferent stage, right? Where I treat everyone the same. If there was anyone here who needed that help, I would give it to them. Not acknowledging the fact that you are really literally excluding a whole population that
Mm.
cannot use that library.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Um, how do you, or do you have any tips or tricks on how to get others to start their journey? You as
Yeah, yeah. That's a hard one. And that I will say this comes up in not only my equity, diversity, and inclusion work, but also my work with misinformation and disinformation,
Mm.
right? So we can give people all of the strategies and techniques. Um, and if they're not willing, if they're not able, if they're not ready, nothing you say is going to make a difference, right?
Mm.
So I'm a big believer in readiness, right?
Mm.
And some of my research has brought me to studying cults and religious organizations, right? And also studying people who have had addictions, right? So it's not uncommon to hear people who have been addicted to say, my family tried to send me to rehab and then I relapsed. Or my parents did an intervention to get me out of this group, but I went back. They
Mhm.
weren't ready, right?
Yep.
And when you hear them talk about like what finally brought them to the other side, if you will, it was some type of transformative moment that was relevant to them. And it was just, sometimes it's just like flipping a switch. And then they were ready and they were able to make whatever change they needed. So I always say, you may not be able to kind of dictate, not dictate, and I know you didn't mean it that way,
No.
but not dictate, but just kind of say, you have to start this journey. We can't do that. All we can do is provide the context and provide the tools
Mhm.
and provide some guidance and, maybe some feedback. But they have to be ready to go on whatever journey that is.
Yep. Wonderful. And support tools, any thoughts on support tools we should have available to support people that switch flicks?
To support patrons or support.
Patrons as well as other team members.
Oh, sure, sure, sure. I'm always a fan of just having whatever books or resources. Just for example, and I know people work in culturally incompetent organizations. I have certainly worked in them myself. I would go to conferences and leave the handouts in the common area, or, depending on the organization that you're in. Sometimes, if the organization pays for you to go to conference, maybe they'll give you an opportunity to say how the conference was, right? And I would always use that as an opportunity to talk about a particular session or a particular tool or something of that nature. So it's a little bit more of a passive approach.
Yep.
But I think, that's where we need to be sometimes with that.
Mhm.
And just leave it out where people, can access it. And, for me in particular, just because of the work that I do, people know that they can ask me questions, right? So I think that there's an approachability factor and, letting people know that you are willing and able to have certain conversations. And when they're ready to ask, then you'll have that information and those tools available for them.
Wonderful. One of the attendees today has said, thank you very much. Um, last year there was a failed referendum in Australia to enshrine our First Nations peoples in the Constitution.
Mm,
As a result, the community groups have suffered a setback and are less willing to engage with
yeah,
institutions.
yeah.
Any suggestions on how we can navigate these difficult situations when it seems that society is undoing social progress, such as the recent law changes in Alabama?
Mm. Yeah, that, I don't have a clean answer for that, unfortunately. It's a different type of willingness and readiness,
Mm,
right? And as I say to my students, as a visible minority, as someone who is has been actively legislated against in the United States, there are sometimes when I'm just tired, right?
yeah.
And I know that, there are lots of folks from marginalized populations who are just, they're just tired. Um, so, I don't know how much you can do other than just to give them time and space, but also empathy and understanding,
Yeah.
right? And I think, along with that, this idea of we will be here ready when you are, right? We're going to be ready to help when you want to, get back in.
Mhm.
But then also on your side, what can you do to advocate on their behalf while they're trying to decide whether they want to come back? So I think it's a little bit of a two-pronged thing. So back to one of those definitions, when it says that you are using your privilege and power
Mhm.
to advocate for other people, right? And you're doing that when they can't, and you're doing that when it's not necessarily convenient for you, but you do it because it's something that you believe in. So I think giving them some time and space, and also you can continue the work until they come back in.
Wonderful. Another question is, have you seen any creative examples of ways of promoting cultural change and start, in workplaces?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So the short answer is yes. I think the more complicated answer is your mileage may vary, right? What works in another place, one place may not work in yours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm thinking about one library that, and again, this was pre-COVID, this was pre, kind of this uptick in legislation. Um, One library would send out a weekly email with a definition, right? Or a definition and a discussion. So let's talk about privilege, and let's talk about this, and let's talk about that. And so I've then subsequently heard other libraries trying to do the same and having a horrible reaction,
Mm,
right? So it really depends on the culture and the readiness of the organization that you're in, right? So, but this is also to say that small actions matter, right? I think the grand sweeping changes, I think that's where we get into trouble, um, because we're not accounting for where everyone is on these various spectrums. Um, so, I mean, like we talk about getting to know our communities, we have to really know our organizations before we try to enact any change. But I think, that's where guest speakers come in.
yeah.
That always worked for me when I was working in organizations that weren't really ready. Because sometimes they think, oh, it's just Nicole whining again. And Nicole is just, and Nicole's just being sensitive. But then when you bring in other people and they can say, oh, it's not just her, right? So certainly don't recreate the wheel. There are any, you know, inordinate amount of resources and guest speakers and other voices that can help facilitate that change.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Um, no, that's been wonderful. These seminars are great as well. We all appreciate having you here.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Thank you.
last night for us, today for us.
Yes.
um, yes, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Just trying to read through them all.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, another person's mentioned readiness is really a great point, and
Yeah.
thank you for reminding us. And maybe having your model handy for people to
Yeah,
see. And
absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes having like, just even a visual And I've also found that just having the language to be able to have these discussions can make a big difference too.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. Everyone's looking forward to your book as well.
Thank you.
But we do have, I'm pretty sure we have Nicole's first edition book on indie reads that people can borrow and read as well. We just really appreciate your time. And again, thank you. Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
attending today. Nicole kindly allowed us to tape record this session. So please, if you have team members who missed out today or you think may enjoy and grow from this session, please share. We will send out the link shortly. Also, I'm going to use this time to say the Reference Information Services group is currently a group of one, me. I need your help from the rest of the state. We don't expect you to do what I'm doing today as part of the group. It is a group. We all take different roles. And please email me if you have someone in your team or you would like to assist me with these future webinars because they are so valuable and we want to keep them going. And I am only one person. I do have the lovely help of the State Library with Ellen, and she is there for the group to help us. But the group has we get a lot more out of this if I get group suggestions than just me and Alan, or Alan and I, if I use correct grammar. But, thank you again, Nicole. We really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you all.
You are wonderful. Thank you. Have a lovely evening, Nicole,
All right.
and everyone else. Have a lovely day and keep an eye out. We will run some more sessions this year as well. Thank you.